Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 268, I chat with David Mackenzie about compressing video for Blu-ray and beyond. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded August 13th, 2015. Episode 268, all about video compression. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week's guest geek is David Mackenzie, a video calibrator and Blu-ray compressionist, who's going to be talking with us today, not about calibration, but about compression. Hey, David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, thanks. Thanks so much for being here.
No worries.
Those who are tuned into the live stream at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room there or at irc.twit.tv can post questions for David as we go, and I will pass along as many as I can. It helps if you use my screen name, Scott Wilkinson, all one word, no spaces or dashes or anything like that, because that shows up in a different color on my screen, and my eye is drawn to it more immediately. So, David, let's start with, what the heck does a compressionist do?
We compress things.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and
it's been great being on. Thank you. I'm glad I could. Basically, if you're talking about the size of uncompressed video data, even at 1920 by 1080p at 10-bit, which is usually what the masters are at the moment. I know 1080p is not new and exciting anymore, and now everything's going to 2160. But anyway, using it as an example, like a 2-hour movie can easily nearly fill a 2 terabyte hard drive.
Oh, man.
And as everyone knows, we don't watch movies off of hard drives because do you want to? What is it? For example, what does a 2 terabyte hard drive cost? It's like $100 or something like that.
100, yeah, something over $100 probably.
That's deluxe Laserdisc box set pricing right there. Nobody wants to buy a movie on a hard drive, so we compress the size down to something more realistic, to something that can be cheaply replicated. Like DVD, or fortunately now the price has come down to Blu-ray disc. And to do that, everyone watching the show will know that the capacity of a dual layer DVD is about 8.5 gigabytes, and a dual layer Blu-ray disc is 50 gigs. So my job is to get from an uncompressed or very, very mildly compressed studio master down to something that people can enjoy in their own home without remortgaging their house.
Now, you mentioned something, and I wanted to make sure we understood this, that even the file you get is somewhat compressed. I mean, the data that's coming off, say, a digital cinema camera is much more even than what you end up with, right?
Right. So, it depends on the project. Usually, in the past, we would be for high definition. The data I received would actually come on professional videotape. We've got an image of one actually, and it's it's
actually you didn't send that to me ultimately.
Oh, I didn't send it. Oh well, we'll have to use your imagination then, I guess.
Sorry.
They would usually come on HD Cam SR videotape, or in the past like a D5 tape. So big cassette. I'm sure my little visualization here is really filling in for the missing image. Or sometimes for longer movies, it would be spread across a couple of tapes, and you'd have to join them up. And yeah, you're right. The signal on an HD Cam SR or a D5 cassette was already compressed. Those systems had their own internal codec in order just to fit all that data onto the tape. They would call it visually lossless. Which 99% of the time I'd agree with. The perversity though of the old workflow was that once we got that HD Cam SR tape, we would put it into the VTR and then capture it as an uncompressed signal onto a hard drive. So we were going from film scanner to recording onto very, very, very high quality professional videotape with a little bit of compression, then to capturing as an uncompressed signal again, then compressing from that. which didn't really do any harm to quality. It was just kind of silly. Now that tape-based workflows, they're kind of a thing of the past now. Increasingly, we're just getting masters in Apple ProRes format, which is it's very, very similar to a system like HD Cam SR, only minus the cassette. It's a QuickTime file basically. And it's very, very, very mildly compressed, and you can encode from that, and it's nice and efficient. You get a great result out of that. Sometimes though, we'll get an uncompressed file, the whole hard drive with nearly 2 terabytes full, or we'll get a DPX image sequence, which we then have to encode from. So it can be a variety of formats just for the movie. Usually now it's file based. And then, of course, considering that, part of a compressionist's job is also taking bonus content like old archival interviews from around the world. We'll have to deal with some really obscure older tape formats and find a way to transfer those. And if they're in PAL format for Europe and the DVD or the Blu-ray disc is going out in the US, it has to be frame rate converted to 60 hertz. Shall I stop talking? I could go on for days and days like that.
No, that's all right. Actually, that's kind of what the job entails. And now you're getting it mostly by just digital files, either delivered on a hard disk or maybe even downloaded from a lot of the time because the Dropbox type of thing.
Kind of like the professionals, the professional equivalent of Dropbox really is something like Aspera Connect, which IBM recently bought. It's a very, very fast file transfer system. Like the bandwidth I've got at my facility here, like when no one else is in the building, it could go to like 800 megabits down and up. So
symmetrical 800 gigabits, I like it.
Megabits, 4G, gigabits. Wow. I mean, if it was, I wish it was gigabits.
Yeah.
When you have that kind of bandwidth, using jet fuel to get masters around, there's less point in doing that. But there's a lot of deliveries too.
Yeah. You mentioned the movie itself and the extra bonus features that might be in all sorts of different formats and whatever. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that the process of assembling that all together is called authoring.
Right, exactly.
And so I'd love to hear you talk a bit about the difference between compression and authoring.
Right, and a lot of people confuse the two. Like if you read forums, you'll sometimes see people say, "Well, this disc has better picture quality; it's better authored." That's not really technically accurate. I mean, broadly speaking, the authoring determines the functionality of the disc. Authoring is stuff like putting in the programming code that will like play the FBI warning and make it unskippable. Sorry, not my decision. My hands are tied up.
We got to be angry at somebody for that.
Exactly. Actually, I increasingly tell studios, look, why would you give your users any reason to resent you like this? They know copying movies is illegal. Anyway. Right. It's all the programming code that like plays the right clip at the right time and turns on the subtitles if you asked for them and checks the region code as well. Again, not my decision. It's contractual. Whereas, so basically speaking, authoring is all kind of functionality stuff. Whereas video encoding, video compression is what determines the picture quality. You can, you can have you could have the same encode of a movie authored by two completely different facilities, two different people, and the picture quality would be the same. And we have an image. We have an image showing like what I look at all day. So this is actually an image of Sonarist BD. This is
authoring, right?
This is the authoring. So you can see here, like at the bottom view. Whoops, it's a light activated sensor in here. You can see the bottom. I've got an interactive graphics overlay, which is what basically, when it's summed with the background video, becomes a menu, and I have buttons for subtitles, subtitles off, English subtitles, and then at the top view you have like the really kind of heavy Blu-ray spec stuff with titles and movie objects, and those movie objects have playlists associated with them, and that all determines what parts of the video play and in which order. So that authoring is the much more kind of cold technical. There is, I'm sure I'll upset someone by saying this, but there's arguably less of an art to authoring. Like the disc either gives a satisfactory user experience, or hopefully, or it doesn't.
Or it doesn't.
Right. Whereas with video encoding, there's much more room for kind of subtle quality differences. Because you're, with compression, to get from nearly 2 terabytes of data down to for BD down, like if you encode like a feature length movie on Blu-ray at like 35 megabits per second, 30, about 30 gigabit file, you end up with, it's a tremendous amount of data that's being thrown away. So as a compressionist, how you manage that process has, and also especially the encoding engine you use and the care you take in adjusting it, that has a huge impact on the final picture quality you end up with.
Which we're going to talk a lot more about. In the meantime, Esol in the chat room is asking, when internet bandwidth gets a lot better, maybe everybody has 200 plus megabits per second or so, don't hold your breath, but it could happen, and more people are streaming movies instead of buying and renting discs, will compression be as necessary? Or do you think streaming formats always are always dictated by the disc compression conventions?
I think they're dictated by something worse than disc compression conventions. Try saying that 3 times fast.
Yeah, really.
Even if we 10, 20 years from now we have a world where everyone has great bandwidth. I think we were promised that 10 years ago anyway, and that hasn't happened yet. If that did happen, the thing that I love so much about optical disc is that regardless of how full, you have two configurations in a BD. You have a single layer disc or a dual layer disc, and it costs the same. Once you've beyond that point, it costs a little extra to manufacture BD50 versus a BD25. But it costs this. Let's just stick with a dual layer Blu-ray disc. It costs the same to manufacture that thing, regardless how full you have it. So, up to a certain point on an optical disc, the bandwidth is kind of free, and it's a very reliable system. Whereas with network delivery, we have usage caps and all this, traffic congestion and stuff like that. Just it's a much more complicated pipeline from getting a data from A to B than a disk is. So the impetus is always going to be there with network delivery to keep the bit rate as low as possible. So to that end, I think actually a compressionist job is absolutely more important for network delivery. Whether or not they, I'm not talking at the moment to any compressionists who are working primarily with, like Netflix or Amazon Instant Video or anything like that. So, maybe if any of them are watching, they could tell us. But the impression I get is that, and certainly from what I see from watching shows on Netflix, and which I'll go into in a minute, but the way I have nothing against Netflix, I actually like it a lot for different purpose. It seems like more of a kind of automated job. Like it's with the. You mean
the compressionist job is more automated?
Right. I think it's. For example, I've watched stuff on Netflix where the video source was clearly 60i, and the whole thing hasn't been deinterlaced, and. To have that kind of thing, but I think that's just a reality of the quantity of material that they're dealing with, and how fast they have to get it up there. Whereas in a typical Blu-ray production process, that would never get past quality control. And I guess maybe the difference there though is that like once you've encoded something and authored it and sent it to Sony or whoever it is who's going to manufacture it onto a disc for you, it's on that disc forever. Whereas with network delivery, you have the chance to fix stuff after the fact.
Oh, that's a very interesting point, and it relates exactly to my career as a journalist. I spent most of it in print, and once it was in print, it was done.
Right.
But now I'm online, and I post something online, and somebody posts a comment and says, you got this wrong, and I verify that I did. Then I can go and fix it.
Right, exactly.
Which I really like.
It is good. Trust me, there have been times, as much as I am, Mr. Physical Media, there have been times where I've thought, wouldn't it be great if we could, fix that one little thing after we shipped it? But,
right.
It's it is what it is.
Yep, it is what it is. Couple more questions here. Beatmaster is asking, how often, if at all, does a director get involved in the creation of the disc?
I think that's more likely like with like current premium Hollywood movies, and the reason for that is that with most of the content I deal with, it's a lot of older stuff. Sometimes the directors either they're doing other stuff now, or maybe they're not still with us. It is certainly one of the labels I do work for. I do a lot of work for Arrow Films in the UK, and they're branching out to the US now. And we did a brand new restoration of a Italian giallo, like an Italian horror film called Blood and Black Lace, which is like a real cornerstone of that genre. And the director has since passed away, but what we were able to do was work really, really closely with basically a guy named Tim Lucas, who is an expert on that director's work, and he would check out the encodes and check out the color grading process, especially, which is a separate process. So directors usually they'd be less involved in compression. Where
more so in color grading, I suppose, right?
Right. If you're going to bring the director in, some of them, I imagine, like for like the likes of Steven Spielberg and people like that, or maybe the ones who are more technologically aware also will want to have a look at the encoding process just to make sure that everything they've done is preserved as best as possible. But if you're going to spend time and money bringing the director in, it's better to involve them, like in a stage like grading or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the process of what's called telecine or scanning, film scanning. If you've shot something on film, and there still are directors that shoot things on film, and older archival stuff as well. You need to convert that to digital. How does that affect your job?
Quite a bit. I mean, the quality of film to video transfer has come on so far, even in the last couple of decades. Do you remember back to the launch of Blu-ray? Blu-ray, I mean, as a package media format for watching pre-recorded movies on in 2006, and what some of the first titles looked like. Oh man,
they looked awful.
It was. I remember it clearly. It was at the time with like BD versus HD DVD, that whole mess. And that's not to say that every HD DVD looked great and every Blu-ray disc looked bad. But there were some interesting choices made for the launch titles.
I remember, of course, I'm sure everybody remembers the first release of the Blu-ray of The Fifth Element, or The House of Flying Daggers, which you and others have called The House of Flying Artifacts.
Right. Well, it's interesting you bring up Fifth Element, because I didn't see the original version, but I remember they redid it with an AVC encode, and they did some more tweaks to it, but it still wasn't a fantastic, So I have to say here that my opinions are, by the way, are my own. They're not
your own.
Right. But they're actually doing. There's actually a version of that movie out in Europe, which is the dynamic range is a little bit more crushed, but it's a newer scan, and it looks a lot better. On the whole, like the resolution's a lot better. So, but I believe they're revisiting that, and I imagine, maybe with Ultra HD Blu-ray on the horizon, maybe that who knows, maybe that'll be a launch title, and they'll do that interesting movie justice. What was the question? So, I went off on a tangent.
Telecine.
Okay,
and how did that affect the launch of Blu-ray? I think that's kind of where you were headed.
I wouldn't say. Well, okay, film transfer technology came on a long way, and like in the past, I mean, what you need to remember is that transfer of movies to high definition has been going on since I believe, Universal, I think, were doing it in the mid 1990s.
Before HD TV was even
for HD TV, or whatever they envisage as the future usage for that, and then especially when DVD was big, it was common to do a high definition transfer of the film, but then put out the down convert on DVD. DVD obviously would be a lot more forgiving if you had a master with a lot of noise in it, for example. And what I'm really trying to get into and organize my thoughts here is what the difference between grain and noise is. Because in the past, like with older fashioned ways of transferring film to video, a lot of these old systems were using a CRT as I guess actually as a light source, you could say.
Light source, yeah.
As a modern film scanner, they're all based on like a CCD or a CMOS imaging sensor, so they're a lot more like a really, really good digital camera. And the point that I'm making here is that, and I don't want to fully blame the the interesting Blu-ray launch on one type of telecine technology in particular, but I think it was a big factor that wasn't often addressed. But essentially, the difference is that with older film scanning technology, older telecine technology, you would end up with a picture with quite a lot of video noise in it, which is very hard to compress, mixed in with the film grain. And what was standard practice at the time for, like, when they were using these older machines, and by the way, the amount of video noise in a CRT-based system, it would on a CRT telecine, it would increase as the tube aged. So the impetus was always there to after or even during the transfer to video was being done, to put in DNR, like a noise reduction device, in the chain. So often we get these older transfers done on these older machines that have noise reduction baked into them, and often whenever we can, we reject them and ask for a new one. Whereas now we have really, really good solid state based film transfer technology. Thank goodness. The practice now is just to leave everything alone. Now that there's no noise in the transfer anymore, what people often see when they think of when they see the film grain is they think it's noise. It's not. With a modern transfer, all you really have in there is grain. And they're leaving it alone now. So did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it did. And we're going to get into DNR, digital noise reduction, and film grain in a second. But first, I wanted to make sure that we were technically correct here. Who is it? Drew in the chat room is saying, I thought that telecine, the word, specifically referred to the conversion of 24 frames per second to 30.
No, that's
not true.
I've seen that misused. No, that would be 3.2 pull down you're thinking of.
Right, exactly.
Or just frame rate conversion. No, telecine is telecine also is a little bit of a dated term. I mean, generally speaking, telecine would be used to define a real-time 24 or 30. Yeah, we can say 24 frames per second because it's 24 real frames. Real-time transfer of film, whereas film scanning is often done not in real time. Like I don't know off the top of my head what the speeds are, but like you can do you can leave the machine more time, and it will maybe transfer in 4K at something like I think it's like 10 or 12 frames per second now. Whereas the telecine transfer would be, I mean, it originated from broadcast of movies on live TV, so it had to be live.
It had to be real time. Yeah, exactly.
It had to be. That's the main difference. So we're moving away from telecine transfers now and into film scanning. But yeah, there's overlap between all this terminology.
Exactly. Blue Rules brings up a question about the next topic I wanted to talk about. He says, I know DNR, digital noise reduction, is a bane on Blu-ray, but does it save space?
Yes, absolutely. But I am
at a high cost.
I am under no discernment whatsoever. Like any film transfer I get, it gets left alone. In fact, what I do is usually will encode the movie wherever possible at like 35, 40 megabits per second. On Blu-ray, the max video bit rate is 40. Now, not everything needs that, but like I said, you have a 12 centimeter optical disc. Why not fill it? What I do usually do though is add a lot of what people in forums call DNR, a lot of noise reduction to video camera based interviews, talking head footage, because who's if you watch one of those and no one is going to complain about the video noise has been reduced in an interview, no one minds provided it's done well. My philosophy, my process absolutely is to reduce the space wherever possible, so the film grain, which is part of the image, it's not an artifact, so the film grain has enough room to breathe. Basically, film grain fine, video noise no.
And in fact, you've said to me before that preserving film grain is the compressionist's #1 job.
I would say so. I mean, it would.
That's amazing to me, actually.
someone who's working on, a lot of like CG animated movies. Of course, they're going to have a different opinion. For their approach to compression is going to be different. But for someone like me who's working mainly on a lot of new scans, actually, of stuff shot on film, yes, preserving film grain is it's what I spend most of my time doing. Which is again why I get so annoyed when there's like some TV manufacturer out there goes, oh, we have new noise reduction, we can take all the noise out. Just when
you spend so much time preserving because it's not noise, it's part of the image.
Exactly, that is the film. That's how the image in a film is formed. Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time fine-tuning encoding settings to make sure the grain stays, because the grain is usually the grain is the more probably it makes encoding more difficult, put it that way, for a couple of reasons.
Because it kind of looks like noise, right? I mean, it's kind of random.
That's it. It's the fact that, like, to the encoder, actually, to computer, there may as well be no difference between grain and noise. It's to a human eye or someone with an understanding of film that cares about the difference. It's difficult for a couple of reasons, because often, number one, the film grain is random. So you can't assign any meaningful motion vectors to it. And of course, on any kind of compressed consumer format, the reason that the reason it's possible to get such good image quality into such a small space is exploiting the temporal redundancy of the source. That is, only storing the parts of the frames that change, parts of the image that change from frame to frame. And I mean, to that end, on a Blu-ray disc at 1080p, Blu-ray only sends a full picture. It's once every 24 frames. Everything else in between those points is reconstructed by the player. And to do that, you have the encoder. That's one of the main things the codec does, is identify what parts of the image are mainly staying unchanged from frame to frame, and to describe grain within that process, this randomly changing pattern. It's difficult, and that's why, like on bad encodes, the grain. We've got pictures, actually. These are both my examples, by the way. I'm not
Yes.
pointing fingers. So this is an example of a test encode. I can't identify the film, unfortunately, which is why it's a shot of a cloud and not something more interesting. But
Right.
I mean, nobody looking at that is going to see what. No one's going to be asking, well, what's the problem with that? And by the way, these are both my encodes. This is one of the ones that didn't get out the door. This is the kind of thing that I'm looking for and catching. And then if you flip over to the image, the good example, the one that was released, there you go. The grain's fully intact. And by the way, the point I'm making, I want to make there, is that both of these images are the same bit rate.
Wow.
So
wow.
a lot of people, I think a lot of people, they put a lot of it makes sense that the end users or end enthusiast users are so interested in the bit rate, because yes, I mean, all else being equal, higher is better. But the point I want to make is that, like, because on Blu-ray you can have a high bit rate anyway, on BD it's almost a given. It's not really the main determining factor in picture quality anymore. I mean, obviously the quality of the master is more important, but also the decisions the compressionist made, the quality of the encoding engine that was used, the quality of the software, and like how much it was fine-tuned to that specific scene or that specific film is usually more important than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that we have so much digital, so many movies are now shot on digital cameras, there is no film grain. Now, I've heard of some directors, and there are some tools that will actually add noise that looks like film grain. I mean, how do you deal with that?
The same way you deal with grain. Randomly generated grain depending on the algorithm. For the all intents and purposes, for compression purposes, it's the same as grain. So, there's your answer.
But what if you get so in other words, you're going to get a master from a director or a producer who says, we shot this on digital, there's no grain, but we want it to look like film, so we're going to add grain. They do that before it comes to you, I guess, right?
Well, I mean, occasionally I've stretched the limits of the job I'm doing, and it's not a compressionist job to define the look of the movie, put it that way. I mean, our job is always to preserve exactly the source as it was, so that would not get changed. That's such another good point, which is why I'm kind of thinking in the top of my head here. I mean, some encoding workflows actually do mess around with the color and the gamma of the source, and there's obviously part of my job as a compressionist, and also someone who's an ISF and THX calibrator and who works in manufacturers for that, to make sure the display is doing its job of reproducing the output image. It would be fairly ridiculous if I was turning out discs that didn't match the colors and the gamma of the master for me to be, pot, meet, kettle, but there are some encoding workflows that actually can alter that kind of thing.
Okay. TN O'Hands, is asking a question I'm not sure I understand, so I'll pose it and see if you do. He says, VLC is working on an X265 codec, which is an H.265 codec stream in which a can capture an H.265 codec stream and store in real time to allow a media. In other words, would this allow a media server to have a DVR function?
In theory, yeah, I guess. Real-time encoding is a little different because, I mean, if the X265 guys are working on it, I'm sure I'm sure it's going to be excellent. Real-time encoding, though, is very different to non-real-time encoding. It's the clue is right there in the name. And like what we're doing on Blu-ray is giving the machine as much time as it needs to make all the calculations it needs to store to encode the best possible result. And on a 4.2 gigahertz Intel chip, that means that again, it all depends on the picture complexity. That can mean like a very good scan of like a 35 millimeter film can take maybe 15 hours to encode a 2-hour movie. Whereas in real time, real time is real time. So that's actually also another key reason why compression on digital TV looks so much worse than a well-done Blu-ray disc. It's the real time. It's just the limitations of real-time encoding. And of course, also the fact that in the U.S., I mean, depending on the cable on the platform, in this country, digital TV is MPEG-2 at a max of 20 megabits per second. So that's also another big reason. Back to the question,
and it has to be done in real time, at least on live broadcasts like news or sports or stuff like that.
Absolutely. I actually, because I'm working on disc, maybe if anyone's watching, they'll tell us. Like I believe with stuff like pay-per-view movies, the encode is done before and then it's distributed, so it's not being re-encoded in real time each time. Like someone has had the chance to fine-tune that. I have to say I don't know because I'm working on. But yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about the codecs then, because there are several. You mentioned MPEG-2, which is the codec used in American broadcast, and it was used on the original Blu-rays and certainly on DVDs. But then we have AVC, Advanced Video Codec, which is also known as H.264, and HEVC, which is known as H.265, which we will probably see on Ultra HD Blu-rays, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Yeah. But for the moment, let's talk about just these different codecs. How do they work, and what's the difference between them?
Essentially, they're all based on the same principle. Like AVC is, you can think of AVC as a continuation of MPEG-2, and HEVC adds yet more and more features. So
these are evolutionary or generational improvements, one from the other.
Right. I mean, basically, the current video encoding this way, they all work by in a couple bullet pointed terms you can think of. They work by identifying redundancies, spatial redundancies. So that would mean,
as you were talking about before, yeah,
things in one frame that stay the same from at a spatial level. If you imagine it's a still image, imagine we're not talking about motion video. Like for example, the black TV behind me, the codec could say, well, the top. Okay, actually, a video from top left to top right, but for the purposes of making it simple, let's pretend it's going from the top right left. It would say, well, this part up here, this is black, and I'm trying to move my hand around here. This is black, and this is also black. This is black too. So that you understand what I'm saying here. It could you can describe this group of pixels very simply. Very simply, and then with motion, it's similar. It's the codecs detect what, like I said before, what changes from frame to frame and what doesn't, and if the image changes, how much does it change, and what is the difference of the change? So essentially that's the basis of all current video encoding. AVC, they just add more and more features as they go. Like for example, AVC has features like deblocking filter to conceal if the bandwidth is too low and you're getting the horrible kind of tiling effect you see often in MPEG-2. AVC has like a feature to smooth over the block boundaries and things like that, and just many more features under the hood that that allow the bandwidth to be reduced, or in the case of Blu-ray, where the bandwidth is constant, for the picture quality to be increased. There's no, as these things evolve, there is no one thing. There's no one eureka moment that makes the picture quality better. It's a lot of little, very, very specific adjustments that are done under the hood.
And not only do you get more features as you go from one generation to the next in these codecs, but also they become more efficient. You can achieve the same picture quality using less bandwidth than you could in the previous generation.
Exactly. Right? Like, by and large, that's correct. But yeah, but like I said, for optical disc, the target is a little different. The target is different.
You don't need to worry about bandwidth. Only
in that, like, if we're saying that the bit rate is fixed, then instead of turning that more advanced technology into smaller bandwidth, which we don't need on an optical disc as much, usually for a movie, unless there's 10 hours of bonus features on there. But to my recollection, that's not the case. And in that case, you can take the picture quality improvement instead. Right.
And so that was going to lead us pretty easily into Ultra HD Blu-ray or 4K Blu-ray, which a number of people in the chat room have been asking about, and I've been sort of delaying that question for a little while. And so we have questions like, how will this, Joe Whip is asking, how will all of this, how will your work be affected with the advent of 4K or UHD Blu-ray? And UJ is asking, what do you think about the new Sony 2160p offerings?
How will my work be affected? 2 words: bring money. This stuff.
Well, isn't that the rule of Hollywood? I mean,
this stuff's not cheap. It's tricky for me to answer that because I have signed NDAs regarding what's going on with Ultra HD Blu-ray. Obviously it's built on top of the current Blu-ray spec, so it's not going to be a complete reinvention of the wheel. But the encoding movies in Ultra HD is and actually also dealing with 4K scans. Sorry, let me just set myself to away here so my Skype contacts go away. Dealing with a 4K scan is quite a bit harder than just compressing like a less sharp, a less well-defined 1080p one. So,
well, you said that a 1080p movie would be delivered to you in a 2 terabyte hard drive, and so I guess with 4K or UHD, it's going to be an 8 terabyte hard drive. The storage
requirements are going to go up. It's going to take longer to encode into multiplex stuff because we've also hit a bit of a ceiling in terms of the speed of computer CPUs. It's not increasing like it used to be. It's going to need more planning, and especially in the early days, we're going to have to figure out. This is only, by the way, thinking for the higher resolution. When we get into stuff like high dynamic range,
that was another question in the chat room.
That's a whole new ball game. Yeah,
because we got high dynamic range, we got wide color gamut, and ultimately maybe high frame rate.
Well, wide color gamut is not so difficult because it's been done in digital cinema for a while, and that's really more of an expense. That's not really. I wouldn't say that's something that's very challenging from a compression standpoint. In the grading suite, you set the colors where you want them on the DCI P3 or Rec 2020. You're right, we can dream monitor. And those and again, as a compressionist, that stuff doesn't change. The color value should not be significantly altered at all. So that's not so difficult. High frame rate, yeah. Again, tricky for me to fully say what's happening with UHD Blu-ray. But
other than the fact that the spec is pretty well known now, and it does allow high frame rate and high dynamic range.
It's in there, right? So yeah. It's so what would the challenge be for high frame rate?
More data, I would think, for one thing.
Having not done it, that's what I'm getting at. Having not done it yet, not necessarily, because with high frame rate, essentially what you're dealing with is more temporal samples, more more still images of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that would mean that for calculating the differences between those frames, there would be less differences between the frames because there would be more frames. Are you following?
Yeah,
So
that's an interesting point.
It's not
if you have more frames, then even things in motion there wouldn't be as much difference from one frame to the next as the thing is moving.
Right, and unless it's really complicated motion like rain or something like that, then absolutely. Oh boy, dealing with more data. But like I said, like the current consumer video formats, they all reconstruct pictures on the decoder end by referring to a reference frame, which is usually called an iframe, which is a whole image, a bit like a JPEG image actually, and then using the calculated differences to reconstruct the intermediate frames. If you had a higher,
which are called P frames, I believe, right?
P frames and B frames and stuff like that, and the differences are quite fairly technical. But yeah, you could with a higher frame rate, you could in theory put the distance between the iframes further apart and reconstruct more of the picture based on the redundancies. So
and therefore get higher efficiency, get a lower bit rate ultimately, and not lose picture quality.
Having not done it yet, I don't want to say for sure because I'm dealing primarily with 24 frames per second. But yeah, it's not as in the case of uncompressed images or images that haven't had the temporal redundancy exploited. Yes, that's going to a double the frame rate. It's going to take up double the space pretty much. But once you start doing more efficient compression techniques, not necessarily. So I don't know what the bitrate overhead exactly would be for high frame rate content, but I'm sure we'll find out.
We'll find out soon enough. For high frame rate seems to be a point of some contention among certainly among enthusiasts. We've seen a couple of examples in the commercial cinema. The 3 Hobbit movies were filmed at 48 frames per second. Filmed. Even I use that term.
I was about to.
Yeah, it's not filmed. It was shot on digital at 48 frames per second, twice the normal frame rate. And people, some people said, "Yeah, wow, that was great," and other people said, "No, it looked like video. It looked like the frame opera, soap opera effect from frame interpolation on an LCD TV." So I'm not convinced that that's going to come on board anytime real soon.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was going to say we can still say film. We can't. No one wants to say it was memory carded at 40 frames.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's getting into like aesthetics of that. I mean, there are two things there. Like people dislike the soap opera effect. I'm one of them because we have 100 plus years of 24 FPS film content. And yes, it did arise out of a technical limitation. If it was invented now, I'm sure no one would want to peg the frame rate that low. But we have so much. We're so used to it now, and the language of cinema has developed around that limitation to the point that, like you say, when directors just double the frame rate and go to 48. No one is. I gather like the reception to it on the whole wasn't good.
Wasn't good. Generally speaking.
I don't want to speak for everyone, but I remember. I mean, this is purely anecdotal stuff, but I remember, just talking to non-technical friends who'd seen the movies in a high frame rate, and it wasn't a positive reaction. Put it that way. So I mean, high frame rate stuff. Good to have support for it because I mean, movies like that were shot that way. I would want to watch them that way. That is, again, it's purely the director's choice how that movie should look, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And I'm by the way, I'm talking not as a compressionist here. Obviously, it goes without saying that as a compressionist, you replicate what the director put on there. My as a compressionist, my personal tastes do not come into it. Right. Whereas, like, for home viewing, again, being a video purist, it's the same. I would want to watch, if that's what you want the movie to look like. Okay, fine. That's how I'm going to watch it. That's how I'm going to judge the work. But like you said, I mean, I'd be surprised if 24 FPS is not going anywhere anytime soon. Put it that way.
Anytime soon. Yeah. On the other hand, high dynamic range, I think, is coming, and relatively soon. We now have 4 examples in that have been in the theater in Dolby Vision high dynamic range. Interestingly, I've gone to see all 4. In fact, all 4 of those movies I went to see more than once. Once in a Dolby Vision theater and once in a standard dynamic range theater. And in every case, the high dynamic range did look better. But in some cases, it didn't look as much better as I expected, while in other cases it did. So I'm tending to think that might be an artistic decision by the director. But my question for you is, how does high dynamic range affect what you do? For example, we'll go from 8-bit to 10-bit. You said that even now your content is delivered in 10-bit, and you've got to bring it down to 8 for Blu-ray.
That's right. That's right.
But now, with high dynamic range, I wouldn't be surprised if it's delivered to you in 12-bit, and you're going to then probably have to take it down to 10.
That's a good question. Like studio deliverables for HDR content, having not done one yet, yes, it could be 12. It could be 12-bit delivery. It could stay at 10. It's an interesting subject because, yeah, like obviously from going from 10-bit down to 8-bit, that's already something that I have to deal with, and the way you do the conversion actually depends on the content of the picture. Like the way to convert 10-bit to 8-bit for like a CG movie, for example, that has no film grain in there. Mainly what you're doing there is fighting banding. And to do that, the compressionist, that job does fall in the compressionist's hands, is adding dither to the image, which, by the way, is totally a very convoluted workaround for getting banding-free video into an 8-bit delivery platform. But that's the limitation we're stuck with the current BD spec.
And just to make sure everybody understands, if you have an 8-bit signal that came from a 10-bit signal and you have to bring it down like that, you might very well get banding in the image that you will see when the color changes very gradually, like a blue sky or something, where this blue in this part of the scene might be very slightly different from the blue here. You'll see an edge or a boundary between them, and you're trying to hide that with dither, which is a form of noise, actually, that you're adding to the picture.
Right. I mean, the best way to think of banding, I've actually heard it was a translated Japanese manual for one video encoder that's very popular in Hollywood, Cinemacraft encoder. And the Japanese authors of that didn't call banding; they called them tone jumps, which actually I think is a much better term. And it is what it sounds like. It's like you just described banding, where you would expect to see a smooth, continuous tone. You can instead start seeing little ridges in there. And yeah, that arises if you have a 10-bit source and you convert it to 8-bit simply by truncating, just like cutting off the least significant bits. Whereas, like you said, like we talked, the correct way to do that, the correct way to transform a 10-bit image into an 8-bit image, is to add very fine dither noise, which prevents the banding from occurring. But that goes completely against the whole mechanisms of compression, because these codecs are designed to strip out very small, very similar details like dither. So essentially what a compressionist has to do when they're adding dither to get into a 10-bit source to produce a clean or a good looking 8-bit output, is configure the encoder in a way which the encoding engine it depends on the encoder, which is why I'm hesitating here to phrase this correctly. Sometimes you can get the source an 8-bit source pre-dithered, which you then feed to the encoder, or sometimes the encoding software handles the dither for you. Either way, you then have to adjust the encoding settings to absolutely preserve as much of the dither as you can, because if the encoder strips the dither out, you're back to square one again, and you're seeing banding. So it's a very kind of convoluted setup we have at the moment. But fortunately for me, because what I'm mainly dealing with is movies scanned from film, yes, we'll dither anyway, but you could truncate down to 8-bit and it would look the same with film, with most film content. If there's enough grain in there, the grain itself actually acts as a dither.
A dither. I was going to ask you that. Yeah, exactly.
What can't film grain do? It's magical, isn't it? It's generally speaking, unless it's very fine grain or a very, very maybe like a 65 millimeter or 70 millimeter movie, you wouldn't really have to worry too much about that with film content. It's mainly CG animation is the danger zone for that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Because it's so clean to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. It's cleaner. It's you're if there's any imperfections in that, you're absolutely going to see it.
Yeah. Berniak in the chat room is asking, how long does a compression usually take? And I guess I'll add to that. How long does it take to compress a 2-hour movie?
It depends again on the complexity of the picture, the amount of high frequency content. If a movie someone asked before, if the movie has been DNR'd, is it easier to encode? Yes, it's also a lot faster to encode because there's less data, there's less of the original film in there.
Right.
There's less motion because the grain is all powdery and gone and yuck, and there's usually less detail because detail, like on the single frame level, detail usually gets lost too. When you do that kind of processing. Because we're leaving everything alone, to encode like a more complicated 2-hour movie on the very best encoding settings, it can take about 14, 16 hours. And during that time,
that's just the encoding process. Once you've set everything up, right?
Right, exactly. So before the full encode is being done, I'll carve out little test regions of the film. Ones that I think are like a representative sample of what most of the movie looks like, and from there, like I'll try different things, I'll try different settings, and I'll find out basically which encoder settings do the least amount of damage to the output. And then after that, I'll do the first encode, the first pass. I should call it a pass because then we're talking about variable bitrate and stuff. The first encode of the whole movie using those settings, and then what I'll do is I'll interleave it, and then have a really close look at everything. So by interleaving, what I mean is I'll put up frame 1 of the master, then frame 1 of the encode, then frame 2 of the master, then frame 2 of the encode, and advance through them. Or you can do a side-by-side split or a side-by-side view or something like that. And then basically, really basically, like I said before, stare at the film grain or any other kind of like fine texture that's in there, and make sure that the encode is doing a good job of preserving the look of it.
Blue Rules is asking, how big of a TV or projector do you look at when you're doing your work? Or do you look at the image on a computer screen? And if so, what size? Do you also look at the image on the largest screen possible?
That's a really good question, actually. I mean, it's purely in terms of size, it actually doesn't matter much what size of screen you're looking at, because the compression
except for that the smaller the screen, the less visible any problems will be, right?
Not necessarily, because usually you're looking like a 200 or 300% zoom. So yes, so that, which is actually it's actually better to look at a little 24 or 30-inch computer monitor. I mean, to answer the question, I've got a 40-inch display on my desk and also 28-inch monitor, but it's actually better to use a smaller monitor and then do like a 200-300% enlargement, because then that way you're not looking at the pixels of the screen itself. The other interesting point that I always bring up, though, with like doing critical assessment of encodes, is the display technology matters a lot. And for really checking an encode, I would not use a plasma display. Although I love plasma displays for enjoying movies, I would never use one to check the encode, because the way those operate, I actually operated, it's past tense now, the way those operated. A, they had their own dithering noise in the image, and then B, they were an impulse type display, so they would have a little bit of gentle flicker to them, and I think that both of those are actually good things from the perspective of viewing them. But for monitoring, for checking encodes, I always use LCD, because the sample and hold nature of it's warts and all. With LCD, there are so few distractions between your eyes and the content. Any problems in there really show up big time in an LCD. Also, with a projector, no, I wouldn't use a projector for checking encode quality, purely because you're then introducing the lens. If it's a 3-chip projector, you have resolution loss, usually from
alignment, so on.
Alignment, stuff like that. So The idea, I can tell from the question, the idea is that the bigger the picture, the better. Not necessarily. The simpler the display mechanism for checking out the work, the better. And then you can just zoom in really close and stare at it that way. So yeah.
Do you use professional LCD monitors, or do you use any consumer type products?
I do some checking. This will surprise a lot of people. I do some checking of encodes in basically what amounts to torch mode, which might surprise the hell out of you, seeing like I'm a calibrator as well. But here's the reason. If you have, let me define what I mean by torch mode. I mean bright. Sometimes I'll check stuff out with really bright, with the black level pool elevated a little bit, so I can really see into the dark areas, see if there's any compression artifacts lurking in the shadows, stuff like just to make it easier to see these things. Because keep in mind, when you're going through an encode, you're not doing it to enjoy it. You're
you're not sitting there watching a movie going, "Wow, this is a great movie."
Yeah, this is gee, I love this job. No, it's more like it's total clinical analysis and observation of it. So I would, when I say torch mode, I mean on the display you would have like any noise reduction or stuff shut off, because that's going to kill detail, and it will also kill compression artifacts if there are any visible ones. But I will absolutely look at it with the brightness pulled all the way up, a little bit of sharpness applied, just to make everything stand out that much more. And then once you've done like scrutinizing an encode looking like hell, through this horribly configured display, and then you actually look at it on a nice calibrated, properly set up one, it's like, wow, look at that. So the answer is I'll actually use some things that might surprise you, just to be even harder on myself and to really stare at that image.
Yeah. Berniak in the chat room is asking, is it more challenging to compress a 3D Blu-ray?
Yes, it would be. There's I've not done a lot of stuff with 3D for fairly obvious reasons in a while. With 3D Blu-ray with MVC multi-view coding, it was pretty smart, because the what was it, the left image was called the base view, and then the right image was called the dependent view, and they were difference coded against each other. So it's kind of similar to what we discussed with high frame rate. You would think that encoding twice the number of pictures on a disc would double the requirements. Nope, because the right eye image was usually so similar to the left eye image. The two would be, the left eye image would do the base view would do much of the work in describing the scene, and then to reconstruct the right eye image, it could mostly be done with differential. Is it harder? Yes, it is. Because keep in mind also the 3D extension to Blu-ray was added after the fact, and I frankly thought it was amazing that they managed to do backwards compatibility with that. You can put it's actually not how it ended up. I mean, the idea was you'd be able to put a 3D Blu-ray disc into a 2D player, and it would just play the left eye view. But what we tended to find, though, was the Hollywood studios preferred to do a totally separate 3D only Blu-ray disc, that when you put it into a 2D player or a 2D TV, it would say, sorry, no, this is a 3D disc, and they would completely skip over that amazing backwards compatibility feature. But the reason for that was that, like, I think like they would make subtle changes to the 2D and 3D versions of the movie. Like the 2D version might have like a little more like if we're talking about like a CG animation, for example, the 2D version of a movie originally designed to be watched in 3D would include some kind of compensation for the fact that it was designed to be watched in 3D, but that wasn't the version you were watching. So in the 2D output, they might blur the background in one of the shots more, whereas in the 3D version, obviously, your brain would you would be choosing what to focus on in the image, and I think that is why the whole amazing backwards compatibility feat the BDA and all those engineers pulled off was never really used that much.
Never really used. Doggone it.
It's perverse, really. But
yeah. SSB 201 is asking about anamorphic movies and anamorphic encoding. That seems to have gone away.
I think it's a huge missed opportunity that the current Blu-ray spec doesn't have any kind of anamorphic mode, especially for users of like scope ratio projection setups who then have to, because the resolution is 1920 by 1080, but you're effectively wasting resolution encoding the letterbox bars.
Right.
Not wasting bitrate actually, because again, that's all flat, low frequency stuff. Those bars don't really, the bars themselves don't eat any bitrate.
Right.
Interestingly, the transition between the letterbox bar and the active picture area, that actually can eat a lot of bitrate and cause some problems. So,
how interesting! I hadn't thought of that.
If any users out there of scope like anamorphic projection setups, often I heard actually I was in the THX class in England, the video calibration, and someone commented that for some reason a lot of movies on Blu-ray, the top letterbox bar and the bottom letterbox bar are actually not the same size. Like one is slightly bigger than the other. The reason for that is often, and I'll do this often as compressionist, if there's a movie of that aspect ratio, you shift the active image up just a little bit so it meets the boundary where the actual macro block begins, and then you're encoding the letterbox bars all fully enclosed in their own macro blocks. And then the active picture area, it aligns perfectly with the 24 by 24 block boundary. So you're not wasting any bits or creating any compression artifacts by putting black bar and picture in one block.
In one block, because that's part of how a codec basically works. Is it divides the image into series of blocks, right?
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
And so you want the boundary between the letterbox bar and the active picture area to be at the block boundary as well, which it wouldn't be, I guess you're saying, if the two letterbox bars were exactly the same size.
It depends. Sometimes you get lucky.
Depends.
If you could nudge the picture up like 2 or 3 pixels to get it fully aligning, why not? It's better for compression.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about how much data is thrown away in the compression process. For example, MP3 for audio will throw away like 90% of the data. And you still hear something, it's not as good, but it's certainly reasonable, at least if you're walking down the street with a portable player and earbuds or whatever. How much data is thrown away by these different codecs like MPEG-2, AVC, HEVC?
Regardless of the codec, it depends. It all depends on what the end file size is really. So we can calculate it. Like if we say that, let's go with the most extreme example, which would be uncompressed. Let's stick with 1920 by 1080 to be a little bit fair. Let's not compare.
Sure.
Let's compare well, let's do this. If it's like 1.8 terabytes for a movie, and you're getting that down to 30 gigabytes, that means that your end file is what, 2% of the size of the original? So
I don't have my calculator handy, but
I think that's correct. Do you? Shall we?
Yeah, here I do. I got it. Okay, so say those numbers again.
Okay, let's say that the source is 1,800.
Okay.
And our final file is 30.
Okay. Divided by that. It's like less than 2%.
Less than 2% of the original. There you go.
1.6%.
So there you go. 98% plus is chucked away.
98% of the information is thrown away. And yet still it looks pretty damn good, at least if the compressionist is doing his job.
When people ask me what does a compressionist do, that's my little elevator sales pitch. It's like it's 2% of we throw away. The end file is 2% of the size of the original, but it hopefully looks 98 and 99% as good as the master.
Yeah.
And I think
that's remarkable.
Thanks to like all these encoding algorithms, that's actually possible, it's fairly amazing.
Yeah. Blue Rules is asking, could you theoretically use a H.265 to encode 1080p Blu-rays? I don't see why not.
No, because the current BD spec doesn't support.
Oh, of course, doesn't support HEVC.
I mean, when you say in theory, could you encode a 1920 by 1080 file with H.265? Of course you could. It wouldn't play in a set-top player though. In fact, you know, the authoring software, it wouldn't even let you bring it in. It would say, "What is this?" You know.
What the heck is this?
On the again, I can't talk about UHD Blu-ray, but yeah, it's not it's not rocket science to assume or to know that HEVC is going to be used on the next on UHD Blu-ray.
We already know that. Yeah,
we know. Okay, cool. So
that is not anything under NDA that I know of, anyway.
Well, it's even if it's common sense to use that anyway. So,
yeah, exactly.
But
it's
no,
the latest
like
one.
The spec was designed for actually because of the whole politics. We ended up with the blue. You'll know the current Blu-ray spec supports MPEG 2, VC1, and people don't use either of those anymore, really, right. And AVC. So yeah, we have 3 codec support. That's 2 more than current Blu-ray needs, by the way. But we have the choice.
Good Sound in the chat room is asking, how does the encoder deal with problems like moire in patterned fabrics or backgrounds? Like a brocade wall covering or something like that. That must be just ghastly hard. With
difficulty, I guess. I mean, moire. I think computationally, moire patterns are not really going to be much more stress to the encoder than a lack of moire would be. Certainly, if you have moire in the first place, that means you're in an area of very high frequency. So the answer to that would be it would deal with it the same way it would deal with any other kind of challenging high frequency, assigning more bits to that area. I know this isn't really a question, but if the question is how would you avoid moire, that would be dealt with during the downscaling of like the higher resolution source to the 1920 by 1080 size, and you could use different scaling algorithms that would hopefully avoid that or avoid or reduce that effect. That actually brings me on to another interesting point. I mean, now that we're seeing more and more movies scanned in 4K. And then resized to 1920 by 1080. Something I've been seeing lately is essentially what amounts to aliasing caused by downscaling very high frequency film grain and very high frequency content to 1920 by 1080. And you can usually see this as a kind of like very kind of subtle kind of grid pattern overlaid over the image. So what you can get that if you're downscaling any very high resolution, high frequency source into a smaller resolution where it's not perfectly divisible by the output resolution. So yeah, now we have 4K masters going to 1080p Blu-ray. The choice of scaling algorithm starts to matter as well.
Right. I mean, I've heard it said many times. Joe Kane has said it on this show that if you start with a higher resolution source file, then you're going to end up with, you get a better result. We've seen this in the Sony mastered in 4K
right, that's true.
Blu-rays.
Right, absolutely.
And do you think that's generally true?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. Another point Joe makes, though, is also like really what I just said. And he made the point relating to 2K going into 1920 by 1080 because the resolution is so similar. If you're going to scale 2K to 1920 by 1080, you often get the artifact I just described, like little aliasing patterns. And he was saying it's actually often simpler or better to avoid scaling and just crop the edges a little bit. It would depend on the frequency content of the source. Like if it's very, very sharp, very detailed film grain, yep, you could. Or you keep using film grain as an example, but it could happen with any very, very detailed texture. If it's softer stuff, then scaling is not really gonna, not gonna
really hurt too much.
But if we're talking about best practice, like on the whole, yeah, right.
So one of the things that I would like to talk to you about here on the show is image quality metrics and the tools that you actually use. And you actually created one that we're going to take a look at here.
Yeah, I didn't create the metric, of course. I'm
no.
But I wrote a tool for a CinemaCraft encoder, which I'm using for MPEG 2 encoding for DVD. And nowadays, now the focus is mainly Blu-ray, so I'm spending less time finessing DVD picture quality. I mean, my absolutely, and I have no shame in saying this, if I have time to spend, fine tune the quality, it's going to be of the Blu-ray because the people who care about picture quality own a BD player. That's not to say, though, that I don't care about the quality of the DVDs. So yeah, I wrote this tool called CC Assist, which it basically speeds up the process of finding the best encoding settings that particular encoder lets you change that encoder being a CinemaCraft encoder. So, I mean, the reason I wrote this was I was spending a lot of time like re-encoding the same little segment of a movie over and over, different settings to find like to really see what they all did and to find which ones were best. And in the example you see here, that's the final output. On the left is the source, and then stacked on the right is like version A, version B, and version C done with different settings. And obviously, one of them is like Pixel Pizza, and I did that on purpose. I encoded that one at a really low bit, just to prove the point, just to show you how it works. But normally, the bit rate is the same in all the different encodes, and I'm looking for very fine differences that the different encoding settings make. But also, if you go back to the image and then head to the bottom left of that, going back to your original question about metrics, there is an SSIM calculation. SSIM
Which stands
meaning that's the structural similarity index. And basically, that's these metrics are not perfect. You know, if they were, I would be out of a job. If a computer could tell you, well, mainly if a computer knew what the best looking image was, it would need very, very minimal input from us. The whole point of SSIM is there's a lot of incredibly impressive and complicated math in there that it tries to predict what the highest quality image is, or in more cold hard technical terms, how similar the encoded images are to the source, and which of the defects is less visible to the human eye. And if you go back there, you can see the one that I encoded at the really low bit rate. That's the blue line. Mm-hmm. You can see it's doing its job there, and the higher on the y-axis it is, then the better it is. The green line is the master, the source file. No. The source is not on there because the source by definition, because we're comparing the encodes. So.
Oh, right. Of course.
Source is the perfect reference. Those are three different encodes. You can actually see also what I was talking about earlier in that all these codecs are using, they're exploiting the temporal redundancy. If you'll notice, even on the better looking one, you get little higher peaks every now and then. And you can really see that in the blue line, it goes like, it's usually like peak. The green line's the best one to show it. Actually, it's like peak, peak. The peaks are the iframes. The peaks are the frames where the entire image was sent. How
interesting. Yeah.
So the slightly lower ones are the ones that were not precise, not perfectly reconstructed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I don't use, especially not with ABC. I don't rely on SSIM too much. It's a good tool. Like if you've done a bunch of encodes with like very different settings, it's a decent tool to see where the differences between the encodes are. But I wouldn't put too much. I wouldn't put a whole bunch of credence in, relying on it to tell me which one's the best. You really have to use a compressionist really has to use their eye to do that. Because
we get to the point of. You can't really rely on a computer to do the entire job. You need your job is secure.
For if the bandwidth was to go much, I mean, you're always going to need someone to take the stuff and put it together. If the bandwidth ever got high enough to the point where less compression was necessary, we could move into a time where fine-tuning the picture quality settings would be less important. Because of what we talked about earlier, I don't see that happening. It would be a good thing if it did. It pains me to say it. If we had unlimited bandwidth, that would be great. But especially now that we have 4K transfers, which have a lot more detail in them, encoding those is harder than encoding an old telecine transfer from a couple, from 10 plus years ago. So the goalposts are always changing in that regard.
Well, listen, we come to the end of a fascinating hour, and we haven't even gotten to all the points I wanted to make, but that means you'll have to come back, will you?
And we didn't scratch the surface. There we go.
I hope you do come back because it's a fascinating subject. I know a lot of people in the chat room are really getting into it. But thank you so much for being here, David Mackenzie, compressionist extraordinaire. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
David has his own website, actually, davidmackenzie.me. So
I don't think there's anything there at the moment.
Okay, well, maybe you might want to put something there.
just wait a bit. We'll put some interesting stuff on there. Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Meanwhile, while you're waiting for that, you can find me at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can find me on Twitter at htgeekscott and at avsforum. And you can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here on twit.tv/HTG and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Matthias Johansson, the CEO of Dirac Research, to talk to us about his company's work in room correction, speaker correction. They make one of the most highly regarded room correction algorithms out there. And so he's going to be joining us all the way from Sweden. So that should be very interesting. It'll be very late night for him, but he's willing to do it. And I just talked to him today, and it's bound to be a great show. So I do hope you will join us. Until then, geek out.